Fewer than 16,000 officers controlled an entire continent. Despite having no surveillance cameras, no computers, and no modern tracking systems, the Gestapo's name alone made 66 million Germans obey. How did such a small organization become one of the most feared police forces in history? The answer lies not in their numbers, but in what they persuaded ordinary people to do. This force operated above the law, free from any court or judge, with the power to arrest anyone, hold them without trial for as long as it wished, and send them to concentration camps with only a few strokes of a pen. Between 1933 and 1945, the Gestapo grew from a regional police force into a tool of total control that stretched across occupied Europe. Its creation began in the chaos of 1933, when one man seized control of Prussia's police and built the foundation for state terror. Hermann Göring founded it. Heinrich Himmler transformed it into a weapon of the SS. Its methods ranged from harsh interrogation rooms to networks of ordinary citizens who informed on their neighbors, co-workers, and even family members. At the heart of this dark chapter lies a chilling question. Why did so many Germans willingly become accomplices in their own surveillance? However, before the Gestapo could terrorize all of Europe, it first had to be born. Its birth began in the spring of 1933, when Adolf Hitler had been chancellor for less than 3 months and a young protege named Rudolf Diels took command of Prussia's political police. What happened next would change Germany forever. Section 1. Birth of the Gestapo. Before Adolf Hitler rose to power, Germany already had political police forces that watched for threats to the state. These units worked under the Weimar Republic, the democratic government that ruled Germany from 1919 to 1933. Each German state had its own political police, and these officers kept files on extremist groups on both the left and the right. They monitored communists, socialists, and even Hitler's party during its early years. Prussia was by far the largest German state and covered nearly 2/3 of the country's land. Its political police force was also the largest. By 1930, Prussia's political police employed about 1,000 officers who tracked radical movements and gathered information on people seen as possible threats. These men worked within legal limits set by the Weimar Constitution, which protected citizens' rights to free speech, privacy, and protection from being arrested without cause. The police could watch suspected radicals, but they could not simply put people in prison without evidence or a trial. This system of checks and balances was about to collapse. The Weimar Republic had struggled from the moment it was created. The harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles left many Germans bitter and resentful. Economic chaos struck again and again, first with devastating inflation in 1923, and then with the Great Depression beginning in 1929. By 1932, unemployment had risen to 6 million. Street battles between communist gangs and party gangs loyal to Hitler left dozens dead in major cities. Many Germans lost faith in democracy and turned instead to parties that promised radical solutions. In his book, The Gestapo in German Society, historian Robert Galately documented that ordinary Germans increasingly supported authoritarian measures during these years of crisis. The endless street violence and economic despair made many people willing to trade their freedoms for order and stability. This shift in public opinion would prove critical to what came next. The party used this desperation very skillfully. Adolf Hitler promised jobs, national pride, and an end to the chaos. His movement grew from a small fringe group to the largest party in Germany by 1932. Although his party never won a full majority of votes, its strength made it impossible for other leaders to ignore. Behind the scenes, powerful forces were making deals that would seal Germany's fate. Conservative politicians and business leaders believed they could control Hitler. They thought they could use his popularity while keeping him on a short leash. President Paul von Hindenburg, an aging war hero who despised Hitler personally, finally gave in to pressure from advisors. On January 30th, 1933, Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. Hitler entered office legally through the constitutional process, and his cabinet included only 3 members of his own party among 11 ministers. The conservatives congratulated themselves on boxing him in. They were badly mistaken. Within 18 months, Hitler would destroy German democracy entirely, and the political police would become his personal weapon of terror. At first, the existing police forces remained in place. Career officers continued their work, now serving new masters. But the new government had no intention of respecting the legal limits that had restrained the old political police. Hitler and his allies planned to crush all opposition, and they needed an excuse to begin. Then came the night that changed everything. On February 27, 1933, the Reichstag building burst into flames. The Reichstag was Germany's parliament building, a grand structure in the heart of Berlin that symbolized German democracy. On the night of February 27, 1933, less than a month after Hitler became Chancellor, fire consumed its great dome and assembly hall. Police found a young Dutchman named Marinus van der Lubbe inside the burning building. Van der Lubbe was a former communist who had drifted through Europe doing odd jobs. He confessed immediately, claiming he had set the fire alone as a protest against the German government. He carried fire-starting materials and showed no signs of having accomplices. But the regime's leaders saw something far more useful than a lone arsonist. They saw an opportunity. Hermann Göring arrived at the scene while flames still rose from the building. Göring was one of Hitler's most powerful allies, serving as both Prussian Interior Minister and President of the Reichstag itself. According to historian Richard J. Evans in his book The Third Reich in Power, Göring immediately declared the fire was the signal for a communist uprising. He announced that the regime would show no mercy to communist traitors. Hitler arrived shortly after, and as he walked through the smoldering ruins, he reportedly grew increasingly agitated. He declared that every communist official must be eliminated and that communist deputies should be put to death that very night. While these extreme statements were not carried out word for word, they signaled the violent crackdown that was about to begin. The very next day, February 28, 1933, Hitler convinced President Hindenburg to sign an emergency decree. This document, known as the Reichstag Fire Decree, suspended most civil liberties guaranteed by the Weimar Constitution. With a single signature, Germans lost their rights to speak and publish freely, to assemble, and to the privacy of mail and telephone communications. Police could now search homes without warrants and hold people in protective custody without trial. The decree transformed Germany overnight. What had been illegal on February 27th became government policy on February 28th. The arrests began immediately. Within days, some 10,000 communists had been arrested throughout Germany. As a result, prisons overflowed so quickly that the regime began establishing makeshift detention centers, the first steps toward the concentration camp system. In his book The Gestapo, The Myth and Reality, historian Frank McDonough noted that the mass arrests targeted not just Communist Party officials, but anyone associated with left-wing causes. Trade union leaders, socialist politicians, journalists, lawyers, and intellectuals all found themselves behind bars. The regime cast a wide net, sweeping up both genuine political opponents and ordinary people who had merely attended a few meetings or signed a petition. Those arrested faced brutal treatment. SA stormtroopers, the brown-shirt street fighters loyal to Hitler's party, ran many of the early detention centers. They beat prisoners mercilessly, and some did not survive. There were no trials, no lawyers, no appeals. Consequently, the protective custody provision of the Reichstag Fire Decree meant the state could hold anyone indefinitely without ever bringing charges. The speed of the crackdown unsettled even some supporters of the regime. Germany had become a police state in a matter of days. Most historians today believe van der Lubbe acted alone, just as he claimed. The regime almost certainly did not set the fire itself, but they exploited it with ruthless efficiency, using a single act of arson to justify destroying German democracy. As Evans documented, the fire gave Hitler exactly what he needed, an excuse to crush his opponents and eliminate the constitutional protections that stood in his way. The Reichstag fire decree remained in effect for the entire 12 years of regime's rule. It provided the legal foundation for everything that followed, from the persecution of political opponents to the eventual targeting of Jews and other groups the regime deemed enemies. With this single document, signed in the panic after the fire, Germany's descent into tyranny became increasingly difficult to reverse. With civil liberties suspended, one man saw an opportunity. His name was Hermann Göring. Hermann Göring was one of the most colorful and dangerous figures in Hitler's inner circle. Born in 1893 to a well-connected family, Göring had served as a fighter pilot in World War I, eventually commanding the famous Flying Circus Squadron after the death of the Red Baron. He was wounded seriously in the failed Beer Hall Putsch of 1923 when Hitler first tried to seize power through force. The injuries left him addicted to morphine, a dependency that plagued him for years. By 1933, Göring had recovered enough to become one of Hitler's most effective lieutenants. He was charming when he wanted to be, brutal when necessary, and utterly ruthless in pursuing power. His appointment as Prussian Interior Minister gave him control over the largest police force in Germany. Göring wasted no time in reshaping that force to serve the new regime. In the weeks after the Reichstag fire, Göring purged the Prussian police of officers he saw as unreliable. He replaced them with loyal followers of the party, including many SA stormtroopers who had no police training at all. He also allowed the SA and SS to act as auxiliary police, giving Hitler's private armies legal authority to arrest, detain, and interrogate anyone they chose. According to George C. Browder in his book Hitler's Enforcers, Göring understood that controlling the political police was the key to controlling Germany itself. Whoever ran the secret police could silence critics, eliminate rivals, and ensure that no opposition could organize. Göring intended to be that person. On April 26, 1933, Göring formally separated the political police from the regular Prussian police force. He created a new organization called the Geheime Staatspolizei, which quickly became known by its shortened name, the Gestapo. The name came from a postal abbreviation, but it would become one of the most feared words in any language. The Gestapo was born not as a national organization, but as a Prussian state agency under Göring's personal control. To lead his new secret police, Göring chose Rudolf Diels. Diels was a career civil servant who had worked in the Prussian political police under the Weimar Republic. He was not yet a member of Hitler's movement, but he was ambitious and willing to serve the new rulers. He had already proven his usefulness by leading the questioning of Marinus van der Lubbe after the Reichstag fire. Diels was intelligent and capable, yet he was not deeply committed to the regime's beliefs. At times he protected certain people from the worst actions of the new rulers, at least when doing so did not endanger his own position. This limited moderation would later cost him his job, as more fanatical figures in the regime pushed him aside. Under Diels, the early Gestapo focused mainly on crushing communist and socialist organizations. Officers raided party offices, seized membership lists, and arrested thousands of left-wing activists. Meanwhile, the secret police also began building files on possible enemies, creating a growing network of informants and surveillance that would become larger and more detailed over time. The methods were often brutal, but they were not yet systematic. That would change under new leadership. Göring expanded the Gestapo's authority steadily through 1933. He established new headquarters in a building on Prince Albrechtstrasse in Berlin, an address that would become synonymous with terror. He increased staffing and provided more resources. Most importantly, he worked to free the Gestapo from any legal oversight. On November 30th, 1933, Göring issued a decree removing the Gestapo from the control of the Interior Ministry's administrative structure. The Gestapo would now answer directly to him alone. No other government agency could interfere with its operations or question its methods. The secret police had begun its journey toward operating completely above the law. Göring envisioned himself as the master of all German security services. He believed his control of the Prussian Gestapo would make him the most powerful figure in the regime after Hitler himself. He was building an empire of surveillance and terror that he expected to dominate for years to come. But Göring was not the only leader in the regime building a security empire. In Bavaria, another man was quietly creating something even more dangerous. Heinrich Himmler looked nothing like a fearsome leader of a deadly force. He was short, with a weak chin and glasses that made him seem more like a schoolteacher than a secret police chief. He had failed as a chicken farmer before finding his role in the movement around Hitler. Yet behind his plain appearance was a ruthless mind and an absolute devotion to Adolf Hitler. By January 1933, Himmler had already spent 4 years building the SS, the Schutzstaffel, or Protection Squad, into a force of over 50,000 men. When he first took command of the unit, it had been a tiny organization of only 280 men who served as Hitler's personal bodyguards, subordinate to the much larger SA. But Himmler had transformed this small bodyguard unit into something Germany had never seen before. He recruited carefully, selecting young men who fit his vision of racial purity and absolute obedience. SS members swore personal loyalty to Hitler and wore distinctive black uniforms that set them apart from the brown-shirted SA. When Hitler took power, Himmler moved quickly to secure his own position in the new order. In March 1933, he was appointed police chief of Munich and head of the Bavarian political police. Bavaria was the second largest German state after Prussia, and controlling its police gave Himmler a powerful base of operations. Unlike Göring, who seized an existing police force, Himmler began building something new from the ground up. On March 22, 1933, just weeks after the Reichstag fire, a concentration camp opened in an abandoned factory near the town of Dachau, outside Munich. Himmler announced that the camp would hold 5,000 political prisoners. Dachau became the model for all the camps that followed, a place where the regime could send its enemies without trial and hold them indefinitely. The SS ran Dachau with intentional cruelty. Guards beat prisoners for minor infractions. Food was inadequate. Medical care was nearly non-existent. Prisoners died from abuse, disease, and what the guards called accidents. The camp served as both a detention center and a threat, a warning to anyone who might consider opposing the regime. According to Jacques Delarue in his book, The Gestapo, A History of Horror, Himmler understood that controlling the camps gave him enormous power. He could make enemies disappear simply by sending them to Dachau. Politicians, journalists, and ordinary citizens who caused trouble could vanish into the camp system, removed from society without the complications of a public trial. While Himmler built his empire in Bavaria, he cultivated a deputy whose ambition matched his own. Reinhard Heydrich was everything Himmler was not: tall, athletic, and coldly handsome. A former naval officer who had been dismissed for misconduct, Heydrich joined the SS in 1931 and quickly proved himself invaluable. He was intelligent, efficient, and completely without mercy. Himmler put Heydrich in charge of a new SS intelligence service called the Sicherheitsdienst, or SD. The SD gathered information on potential enemies of the regime, building files that could be used to destroy careers, imprison opponents, or worse. Heydrich ran the SD with bureaucratic precision, creating an organization that would eventually rival and then absorb the Gestapo itself. Throughout 1933, Himmler steadily expanded his control beyond Bavaria. He took over the political police forces in state after state, using his SS connections and Hitler's backing to push aside local authorities. By early 1934, Himmler controlled the political police in every German state except Prussia, which remained under Göring's command. The stage was set for a confrontation between Göring's Gestapo and Himmler's SS. But both men faced a common threat that would force them into an unlikely alliance. By early 1934, Germany had two competing security empires. But there was a third force that threatened them both. Ernst Röhm was one of the oldest and most loyal of Hitler's followers. He had marched beside Hitler in the failed beer hall putsch of 1923 and had helped build the movement from its earliest days. Röhm commanded the SA, the Sturmabteilung, or Storm Detachment. These were the brown-shirted street fighters who had battled communists in the years before Hitler took power. By early 1934, the SA had grown to a staggering 4.5 million men, dwarfing the German army, which was limited by the Treaty of Versailles, to only 100,000 soldiers. Röhm wanted to merge the SA with the army, creating a new people's militia with himself as its head. This ambition would cost him his life. The German Army Officer Corps viewed Röhm's plans with horror. These professional soldiers came from aristocratic families and cherished their traditions. They despised Röhm personally, knowing he was homosexual at a time when that was scandalous, and they feared his radical plans would destroy the army they had spent their careers building. Hitler faced a difficult choice. He needed the army's support to consolidate power and eventually rearm Germany for war. But the SA had been crucial to his rise, and Röhm was a longtime comrade. For months, Hitler hesitated while tensions between the SA and the army grew more dangerous. Göring and Himmler saw their opportunity. Both men viewed Röhm as a rival who threatened their own power bases. The massive SA could easily overwhelm the SS, or seize control of the Gestapo if Röhm chose to act. Working together, Göring and Himmler began feeding Hitler reports that Röhm was planning a coup. Whether Röhm actually planned to overthrow Hitler remains debated by historians. What matters is that Hitler believed it, or chose to act as if he did. By late June 1934, Hitler had made his decision. He would remove the SA leadership in a single violent operation. The plan would be carried out by the SS, with support from the Gestapo. Göring would direct events in Berlin while Hitler himself traveled to Bavaria to confront Röhm. In the early morning hours of June 30, 1934, SS squads moved across Germany. At a resort hotel in Bad Wiessee, where Röhm and other SA leaders were staying, Hitler arrived in person with armed SS men. The SA chiefs were dragged from their beds and arrested. What followed was a wave of organized violence on a scale Germany had not seen since the World War. The purge continued for 3 days, from June 30th to July 2nd, 1934. SS units shot SA leaders across Germany. In Berlin, Göring directed operations from his headquarters, personally signing orders for men he wanted removed. The Gestapo provided lists of targets and helped coordinate the logistics of the campaign. At least 85 people were confirmed dead, including Röhm himself, who was shot in his cell after refusing to take his own life. The true number was likely much higher. Historian Frank McDonough noted that the regime used the opportunity to settle old scores, eliminating not only SA leaders, but also conservative politicians, Catholic activists, and others who had angered powerful party figures over the years. Former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher was shot at his home and died there, along with his wife. Gregor Strasser, a party figure who had once rivaled Hitler for leadership, died in a Gestapo cellar at the hands of his captors. Gustav von Kahr, the Bavarian official who had helped crush the 1923 putsch, lost his life in a particularly brutal attack. The bodies were never returned to their families, and the regime banned any public discussion of those who had died. Hitler told the nation that he had saved Germany from traitors. The army applauded, and the public largely accepted these violent measures as necessary. Just weeks before the purge, on April 20th, 1934, Göring had agreed to hand control of the Prussian Gestapo to Himmler. The deal had been in the works for months, as Himmler's control of all other state police forces made his takeover of Prussia all but certain. In exchange, Göring retained other positions and the promise of future power. With Göring's Prussian Gestapo now in his hands, Himmler controlled the secret police across all of Germany. He immediately appointed Reinhard Heinrich as head of the Gestapo. The cold, calculating Heinrich would transform the organization from a collection of state agencies into a centralized instrument of terror. The Night of the Long Knives, as the purge came to be called, taught Germany a terrible lesson. The regime could eliminate its own members without consequence. There would be no trials, no appeals, no accountability. Hitler declared that he had acted as the supreme judge of the German people. A law passed on July 3rd retroactively legalized all the violence as measures necessary for national defense. The message was clear. The regime stood above any law, and those who threatened it would be eliminated. The SA survived but was permanently broken as a political force. The SS emerged as the dominant paramilitary organization, answerable only to Hitler through Himmler, and the Gestapo, now unified under Himmler and Heinrich, had proven its value as a deadly weapon of the state. The purge legitimized lethal force as state policy. Now Himmler needed to place the Gestapo above the law itself. Section 2. Consolidation and the Architecture of Fear. The Night of the Long Knives had shown what the regime could do when it chose to act outside the law. Dozens of men had been eliminated without arrest, trial, or evidence. A law passed afterward simply declared all these acts legal, but Himmler understood that relying on after-the-fact laws was inefficient. He needed to place the Gestapo permanently beyond the reach of any court or judge. The German legal system still functioned in 1934, at least in theory. Courts, lawyers, and judges all continued their usual work. Ordinary Germans could, in principle, challenge government actions through the administrative courts. These courts had protected citizens' rights under the Weimar Republic, and some judges nonetheless tried to guard their independence. This presented a problem for Himmler's vision of unlimited police power. In his book, The Gestapo, Power and Terror, historian Carsten Dams documented the legal maneuvering that followed. The regime needed to ensure that no court could ever question Gestapo decisions. No judge should be able to order the release of a prisoner. No lawyer should be able to challenge an arrest. The secret police must operate in a realm where normal law simply did not apply. The process began in Prussia, where Himmler now controlled the secret police. On February 10, 1936, a new Gestapo law was enacted that explicitly removed the organization from judicial oversight. The law declared that its orders and affairs could not be reviewed by administrative courts. In plain terms, this meant that if the secret police arrested someone, no court in Germany could order their release or even question why they had been taken. In most countries, even authoritarian ones, some form of judicial review existed to check police authority. The new law eliminated that check entirely. The Gestapo became, in the words of legal scholars at the time, a law unto itself. But Himmler wanted more than just legal immunity for the Prussian Gestapo. He wanted control of all police forces in Germany. On June 17, 1936, Hitler issued a decree that transformed German policing forever. The decree appointed Heinrich Himmler as chief of German police within the Interior Ministry. For the first time, all police forces throughout Germany, in every state and city, fell under a single commander. The decree placed Himmler nominally under Interior Minister Wilhelm Frick. In reality, Himmler answered only to Hitler himself. As head of the SS, Himmler already commanded a powerful paramilitary force loyal to Hitler personally. Now he commanded all police as well. The merger of party organization and state power was nearly complete. According to historian Frank McDonough in his book, The Gestapo, the myth and reality, this appointment marked the end of any real separation between Hitler's movement and the German state. The police would now serve the ideology of superiority, not German law. Officers would obey Himmler's orders, not written legal rules. Justice would mean whatever the leadership decided it meant. The concentration of power was staggering, but one mechanism above all enabled the Gestapo to operate without limits. That mechanism was Schutzhaft, a German word that means protective custody. The term sounded almost harmless, as if the police were protecting people by taking them into custody. In reality, Schutzhaft was one of the most terrifying tools of the regime's oppression. Under Schutzhaft, the Gestapo could arrest anyone and hold them for as long as it wished without a trial. No charges needed to be filed, no evidence had to be shown, no lawyer could step in. The prisoner simply disappeared into the camp system and stayed there for as long as the Gestapo decided. The Reichstag fire decree of February 1933 had first allowed protective custody as an emergency measure. However, the emergency never ended. The decree stayed in force for all 12 years of the regime's rule, and Schutzhaft became a permanent part of its arsenal of control. In his research on Gestapo case files, historian Robert Geladely found that protective custody orders followed a simple bureaucratic process. A Gestapo officer would fill out a form, a superior would approve it, and the prisoner would be sent to a concentration camp. There was no appeal, no review, no way to challenge the decision. Families often received no notification of where their loved ones had been taken, or even whether they were still alive. Even when regular courts acquitted defendants or imposed light sentences, the Gestapo could simply rearrest them. This practice made trials meaningless for anyone the regime considered a threat. A person could go before a judge, receive a verdict of not guilty, and walk out of the courtroom only to be seized by Gestapo officers waiting outside. They would then be placed in protective custody and sent to a camp, serving a sentence the courts had refused to impose. By 1936, the legal architecture of terror was complete. The Gestapo operated above the law, immune from judicial review, empowered to imprison anyone indefinitely without trial. No German citizen had any legal protection against the secret police. The mere threat of a Gestapo arrest was enough to silence most dissent. With legal immunity secured, Himmler reorganized his empire into a terror machine of extreme efficiency. Himmler was a meticulous organizer who believed that proper structure was essential to power. Having secured legal immunity for the Gestapo, he turned to reorganizing the various police and intelligence agencies under his command. His goal was to create a unified security apparatus that could identify, track, and eliminate any threat to the regime. In June 1936, the same month Hitler appointed Himmler as chief of German police, a major reorganization took place. Himmler merged the Gestapo with the Criminal Polizei, known as the Kripo, which was Germany's criminal investigation police. Together, these two forces became the Sicherheitspolizei, or security police, commonly abbreviated as SIPO. The merger combined political policing with criminal investigation under a single command. The Gestapo continued to focus on political crimes, defined broadly as anything seen as a threat to the regime. The Kripo handled ordinary criminal cases, but also targeted groups the leadership labeled criminal by nature, such as repeat offenders, vagrants, and others judged asocial. Under Himmler, the line between political and criminal policing almost disappeared. Reinhard Heydrich, Himmler's ambitious deputy, became chief of the security police. He now commanded both the Gestapo and the Kripo, which gave him direct control over almost all investigative police work in Germany. At the same time, he kept his role as head of the SD, the SS intelligence service he had built from nothing. The SD and the security police served different but connected roles. According to Dams and Stahler, the SD gathered intelligence on potential enemies and built detailed files on people and organizations. The Gestapo and Kripo then acted on that information, making arrests and carrying out questioning. The SD sent reports to the police, and the police sent their results back to the SD. This two-track system created a formidable surveillance and enforcement machine. For 3 years, the security police and the SD operated as separate but closely linked bodies. The SD remained part of the ruling party through the SS, while the security police was still officially a state agency. This formal difference mattered less as the regime tightened its grip, but it did create some paperwork problems. On September 27, 1939, only weeks after Germany invaded Poland and began World War II, Himmler ordered another reshaping of the system. He created a new umbrella office called the Reich Security Main Office, known by its initials RSHA. This new body brought the security police and the SD together under one command, led by Heinrich. The RSHA became the main headquarters for all of the regime's security operations. Inside this structure, the Gestapo became Department 4, or Amt 4. On paper, it was now only one department among several, but it kept its fearsome reputation and its main role of crushing political opposition. The creation of the RSHA was the final step in building the regime's full security apparatus. Heinrich led the entire RSHA, but he needed strong deputies to manage each branch. For the key post of Gestapo chief, he chose Heinrich Müller, a career policeman who had served in the Bavarian political police since 1919. Müller was very different from the first Gestapo chief, Rudolf Diels. Diels had been ambitious, but not deeply tied to the regime's beliefs. Müller, by contrast, was a strict professional who gave himself fully to any duty he received. He had even investigated Hitler's followers during the Weimar years, yet he now served the new rulers with the same cold commitment. According to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's research, Müller became the operational head of the Gestapo in 1939 and remained in that position until the end of the war. He ran the organization with bureaucratic efficiency, overseeing interrogations, managing field offices, and coordinating with other RSHA departments. Müller survived the war's final days and disappeared in 1945, his fate never conclusively determined. Under Müller's leadership, the Gestapo reached its full organizational maturity. The Gestapo headquarters on Prince Albrechtstrasse in Berlin coordinated a network of regional offices throughout Germany and, eventually, across occupied Europe. Each regional office reported to Berlin while also working with local SS and police commanders. This combination of central direction and local presence made the Gestapo effective far beyond what its relatively small size might suggest. By 1939, the organizational structure was complete. The SD gathered intelligence. The Gestapo arrested and interrogated political enemies. The Kripo handled criminal matters and pursued social undesirables. All three worked under the RSHA, commanded by Heinrich and ultimately answering to Himmler and Hitler. The architecture of fear was fully built. With the structure in place, the Gestapo turned to identifying enemies. But who exactly did they target? From its first days, the Gestapo existed to break political opposition. Its main job was to find, arrest, and silence anyone who might organize resistance to Hitler's rule. In the early years, it focused mostly on the political parties that had opposed Hitler's movement before 1933. The Communist Party of Germany, known as the KPD, was the regime's first and most urgent target. Communists had been Hitler's most bitter enemies during the Weimar Republic. Street battles between party stormtroopers and communist fighters had left dozens dead in the years before Hitler took power. The two movements offered opposite visions for Germany's future, and both believed that only one could survive. The assault on the communists began within hours of the Reichstag fire. As described in Section 1, approximately 10,000 communists were arrested in the days immediately following February 27, 1933. The Gestapo and regular police used membership lists, informant reports, and existing surveillance files to round up party officials, organizers, and known activists. Many were beaten severely. Some lost their lives in custody. Others were sent to the early concentration camps. In his book, The Third Reich in Power, historian Richard J. Evans documented the systematic destruction of Communist Party infrastructure. The Gestapo raided party offices and seized records. They arrested anyone found distributing communist literature. They pressured known communists to inform on their comrades in exchange for better treatment. The crackdown was devastating but not immediately complete. Some communist cells continued operating underground, printing leaflets and trying to maintain contact with members. In response, the Gestapo devoted considerable resources to hunting down these remnants, using informants and surveillance to identify activists. By 1935, the Communist Party, as a centralized organization, had been effectively destroyed. Individual communists continued to resist in small ways, but coordinated opposition became nearly impossible. The Gestapo had broken the party's communication networks, arrested its most capable leaders, and terrorized ordinary members into silence. Those who persisted faced almost certain capture. According to McDonough, the destruction of the Communist Party demonstrated the Gestapo's effectiveness against organized opposition. The secret police had dismantled an entire political movement with mass arrests, targeted eliminations, and relentless pressure. The methods that worked against the communists would be applied to other enemies. The Social Democrats, Germany's oldest and largest democratic party, faced similar persecution. The SPD had governed Prussia before 1933 and spoke for millions of working-class Germans. Unlike the communists, the Social Democrats tried to work within the democratic system instead of overthrowing it. This difference meant nothing to the regime. Social democratic leaders were arrested alongside the communists in the first waves of detention. Many SPD officials fled into exile, establishing a party organization abroad that tried to coordinate resistance from outside Germany. Those who remained faced constant Gestapo surveillance. Even former Social Democrats who had withdrawn from political activity found themselves monitored and sometimes arrested. Trade union leaders, who had long supported the Social Democrats, were also targeted. In May 1933, the regime dissolved all independent unions and replaced them with the party-controlled German Labor Front. Union officials who resisted were arrested. By the mid-1930s, organized political opposition inside Germany had been broken. The Communist Party was destroyed, the Social Democrats were scattered and under surveillance, and no party remained legal except Hitler's party itself. In short, the Gestapo had completed its first main mission, removing domestic political threats to the regime. But political opponents were only the beginning. The regime's idea of enemies went far beyond political parties. Its beliefs labeled many groups as threats to the racial health and social order of the German nation. The Gestapo was ordered to watch, harass, and imprison these people, working with other offices to enforce the regime's views about who was allowed to belong in German society. Religious groups that refused to follow the regime's expectations faced special danger. The Jehovah's Witnesses, a small Christian denomination, became targets almost at once. Witnesses refused to give the Hitler salute, would not join the regime's organizations, and declined to serve in the military because of their faith. These actions marked them as enemies of the state. In 1935, the regime officially banned the Jehovah's Witnesses throughout Germany. Thousands of witnesses were arrested for continuing to practice their faith. They refused to renounce their beliefs even under intense pressure, and this steadfastness only increased the regime's determination to break them. According to McDonough, the witnesses were a small group with no powerful defenders, making them easy targets for persecution. Witnesses who were sent to concentration camps were identified by purple triangles sewn onto their uniforms. Camp guards often singled them out for harsh treatment because of their refusal to compromise. Yet many witnesses maintained their faith even in the camps, holding secret religious services and supporting one another. The regime also targeted clergy from major Christian churches who spoke out against its policies. Catholic priests who criticized the leadership from their pulpits risked arrest. Protestant pastors who joined the confessing church movement, which opposed the regime's control over church life, faced similar dangers. Dachau concentration camp held a special section known as the priest barracks. Over the course of the regime, more than 2,700 clergymen from different churches were imprisoned there. Most were Catholic priests, many from Poland and other occupied countries. Conditions in the priest barracks were harsh, and many clergy died from disease, overwork, or mistreatment. The Gestapo monitored church sermons for any hint of criticism. A priest who remarked that there were good people in England, or who failed to show proper enthusiasm for the war effort, could be reported and arrested. The regime sought to intimidate religious leaders into silence while avoiding an open break with the churches that might alienate ordinary Germans. Religious persecution was severe, but the regime cast an even wider net over those it labeled social outsiders. The regime's ideology of superiority claimed that some people were naturally criminal or antisocial and could never be part of the national community. The Gestapo and Kripo worked together to track and imprison these people, removing them from society for good. Habitual criminals, defined as people with several convictions for theft or similar crimes, were targeted for preventive detention. The idea was that such offenders could not be reformed and therefore should be locked away to protect society. More than 20,000 men and women labeled as habitual criminals were sent to camps, and research cited by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum shows that most of them died there. The regime also persecuted people it labeled asocial, a vague category that included vagrants, beggars, alcoholics, and anyone deemed unwilling to work. Sweeps of major cities rounded up homeless people and sent them to camps. Among the groups the regime targeted were men persecuted under paragraph 175 of the German Criminal Code, which criminalized certain personal relationships between men. The leadership viewed this as a threat to German population growth and racial strength. While this law had existed before, the regime greatly increased its enforcement. In 1935, the law was changed to broaden what was considered a crime and to raise penalties. Between 1933 and 1939, approximately 30,000 men were convicted under paragraph 175 in German courts. Many more were detained by the Gestapo without trial. Those sent to concentration camps were forced to wear pink triangles identifying them. They faced extreme brutality from guards and were often assigned the most dangerous work details. Records show that most men arrested under this law during these years were young, between 18 and 25. Survival rates for pink triangle prisoners in the camps were among the lowest of any group. The persecution extended to those the regime deemed biologically unfit. The regime's eugenics laws allowed forced sterilization of people with hereditary diseases, mental illness, physical disabilities, or other conditions the leadership labeled undesirable. Special hereditary health courts reviewed cases and ordered sterilizations, and the Gestapo sometimes helped by identifying and delivering victims to medical facilities. Between 1933 and 1945, approximately 350,000 Germans were involuntarily sterilized under these laws. The procedures were often performed without proper consent and sometimes resulted in serious medical complications or death. Victims included people with epilepsy, depression, physical disabilities, and even chronic alcoholism. The sterilization program reflected the regime's belief that the German race must be purified of supposedly defective elements. The Gestapo enforced compliance with sterilization orders and punished those who tried to evade them. This program laid the groundwork for even more extreme measures to come during the war years. Yet among all targets, one group would define the Gestapo's ultimate purpose. In 1933, approximately 500,000 Jews lived in Germany, less than 1% of the total population. They were concentrated in major cities, particularly Berlin, and were well represented in professions like law, medicine, and commerce. Many Jewish families had lived in Germany for centuries and considered themselves thoroughly German. Hitler, however, had long blamed Jews for Germany's problems. In his worldview, Jews were not simply a religious group, but a racial enemy whose very presence threatened German survival. This anti-Semitism was central to the regime's beliefs from the moment it took power. The regime began targeting Jews immediately, and persecution intensified step by step over the following years. In April 1933, only a few months after Hitler became chancellor, the regime called for a boycott of Jewish businesses. Party stormtroopers stood outside Jewish-owned shops and warned Germans not to go in. The boycott was badly organized and only partly successful, but it showed clearly where policy was heading. New laws followed quickly. The regime removed Jews from civil service jobs, limited Jewish lawyers and doctors, and cut Jewish enrollment in schools and universities. Each measure pushed Jews further to the edge of German society, making it harder for them to work, study, or take part in public life. The Nuremberg race laws of 1935 marked a turning point in anti-Jewish persecution. Announced at the party rally in Nuremberg in September 1935, these laws stripped Jews in Germany of their citizenship. They became subjects of the Reich instead of citizens and lost their political rights. The laws also banned marriage and intimate relations between Jews and people defined as of German blood, turning private relationships across racial lines into crimes. The Gestapo enforced these racial laws with special intensity. Offices across Germany created Jewish departments, known as Judenreferat, whose sole task was to monitor the Jewish population. These units investigated alleged breaches of the race laws, especially claims of forbidden relationships. According to research from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Gestapo pursued such cases aggressively. A Jewish man accused of a relationship with a non-Jewish woman could be arrested, publicly humiliated, and sent to a camp. Non-Jewish women in these relationships also faced punishment, though usually less severe. The Jewish departments also worked to encourage Jewish emigration from Germany. The regime's initial approach to the so-called Jewish question focused on making life so difficult for Jews that they would leave Germany voluntarily. The Gestapo coordinated with other agencies to strip emigrating Jews of their property and wealth, forcing them to leave nearly everything behind when they fled. By 1938, about 1/4 of Germany's Jewish population had emigrated. Those who remained faced increasingly desperate circumstances. Professional restrictions, social isolation, and constant harassment made normal life impossible. Yet emigration required money for visas and transportation, connections in foreign countries willing to accept refugees, and the painful decision to abandon homes, businesses, and communities built over generations. Then came the night that shattered any remaining illusion of safety. On November 7, 1938, a young Jewish man named Herschel Grinspan shot a German diplomat in Paris. Grinspan was distraught because his family had been deported from Germany to Poland in terrible conditions. The diplomat, Ernst vom Rath, died of his wounds on November 9th. The regime's leaders used the shooting as a pretext for violence they had long prepared. On the night of November 9th to 10th, 1938, organized attacks on Jews broke out across Germany and Austria. This wave of terror became known as Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, named for the shattered windows of Jewish shops, synagogues, and homes. SA stormtroopers, SS men, and ordinary Germans attacked Jewish property throughout the Reich. Over 1,000 synagogues were burned or destroyed. Approximately 7,500 Jewish-owned businesses were vandalized, their windows smashed and their contents looted or destroyed. Jewish homes were invaded and ransacked. The violence was not spontaneous, it was carefully coordinated from Berlin. Reinhard Heydrich sent instructions to Gestapo and SD offices throughout Germany specifying how the pogrom should proceed. The order stated that synagogues could be burned as long as there was no danger to surrounding German property. Jewish businesses and homes could be destroyed but not looted for personal gain. And most importantly, as many Jews as possible should be arrested. The Gestapo followed these instructions precisely. Over the 2 nights of violence, approximately 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. The camps at Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen received thousands of new prisoners, overwhelming their facilities. Conditions were brutal, and hundreds of prisoners died in the weeks following their arrival. According to Evans, Kristallnacht marked a significant shift in anti-Jewish policy. The regime had moved from legal discrimination to open violence. The pogrom demonstrated that Jews in Germany had no protection whatsoever, that their property, their freedom, and their lives could be taken at any moment. The aftermath of Kristallnacht accelerated Jewish emigration dramatically. Jews who had hoped to wait out the persecution now understood that remaining in Germany meant death. Emigration offices were overwhelmed with desperate applicants. Foreign consulates faced impossible decisions about how many refugees they could accept. Many Jews found that no country would take them. Those who could not emigrate faced an increasingly hopeless situation. The regime imposed collective fines on the Jewish community for the damage caused during Kristallnacht, forcing victims to pay for their own persecution. New laws excluded Jews from virtually all remaining economic activity. Jewish children were expelled from German schools. On January 24, 1939, Hermann Göring tasked Heinrich with coordinating Jewish emigration from the Reich. This order gave the security police formal authority over Jewish policy, positioning the Gestapo at the center of what would become the regime's most terrible crime. Within 3 years, the policy would shift from forced emigration to something far worse. By 1939, the Gestapo had built a system of persecution that touched every aspect of German life. Political opponents had been crushed. Religious dissenters had been silenced. Social outsiders had been imprisoned or eliminated, and Germany's Jews faced relentless harassment that would soon give way to systematic destruction. The secret police had proven its value to the regime across all these campaigns. It had identified enemies, gathered intelligence, conducted arrests, and administered the protective custody system that fed the concentration camps. The architecture of fear was complete and functioning. But how did such a small organization actually operate? That question would reveal an uncomfortable truth about German society itself. Section 3. The Myth of Omniscience. The very word Gestapo has become synonymous with total surveillance and unlimited power. In popular imagination, this secret police force was everywhere, knew everything, and could reach anyone at any time. This image of an all-knowing secret police has shaped how generations understand the German dictatorship. Films, novels, and television shows have reinforced the picture of its agents lurking on every street corner, listening devices hidden in every home, and informants planted in every workplace. This fearsome reputation served the regime well. When people believed the secret police could hear their whispered conversations and read their private thoughts, they censored themselves. Fear of the Gestapo kept millions of Germans obedient without the authorities ever having to take action against them. But the reality was far different from the myth. In his book The Gestapo, The Myth and Reality, historian Frank McDonough set out to examine whether the popular image matched the historical evidence. What he found challenged decades of assumptions about how the German police state actually functioned. At its peak strength, the Gestapo employed approximately 16,000 officers to police a population of 66 million Germans. This ratio of roughly one officer for every 4,000 citizens made comprehensive monitoring physically impossible. The Gestapo simply did not have enough personnel to watch everyone, tap every phone, or read every letter. Consider the numbers in specific cities. For example, in 1939, the cities of Stettin and Frankfurt am Main, with hundreds of thousands of residents, had only 41 Gestapo officers combined. In the larger Düsseldorf district, with population of approximately 4 million, just 281 Gestapo officials were available, roughly one officer per 14,000 inhabitants. Clearly, comprehensive surveillance by the secret police was an impossible task with such limited manpower. As McDonough notes, these numbers made it impossible for the Gestapo to live up to its reputation as an all-seeing organization. The secret police could not possibly conduct surveillance on every household, monitor every conversation, or track every potentially disloyal citizen. The resources simply did not exist. The regime also lacked the technology that modern audiences might assume was available. There were no computers to process information, no electronic databases to cross-reference suspects, and no sophisticated listening devices that could be planted undetected in homes. The Gestapo relied on paper files, typewritten reports, and human observers. Their methods were labor-intensive and necessarily selective. Yet the Gestapo's reputation for being everywhere persisted throughout the years of the regime. On his book, The Gestapo, A History of Horror, Jacques Delaruy's dramatic account reinforced the Gestapo's fearsome image, but later research showed he overstated its capabilities. This secret police force intentionally cultivated an aura of unlimited power. Officers encouraged rumors about their reach and abilities. The regime's propaganda machine amplified these perceptions. When people believed they were being watched constantly, they behaved as if they were being watched constantly, even when no one was actually observing them. This psychological dimension of Gestapo power was perhaps more important than its actual surveillance capabilities. The secret police did not need to monitor everyone if everyone believed they might be monitored at any moment. Self-censorship and mutual suspicion accomplished what an army of agents never could. Still, the question remained. With such limited personnel and primitive technology, how did the Gestapo maintain its grip on German society? How did a force of 16,000 control a nation of 66 million? If the Gestapo lacked the manpower to watch everyone, how did they achieve such control? The answer to the Gestapo's effectiveness lay not in its own capabilities, but in the behavior of ordinary German citizens. The secret police did not need to spy on everyone because Germans were willing to spy on each other. Denunciations, voluntary reports by citizens informing on their neighbors, co-workers, friends, and even family members, provided the Gestapo with most of its information. Ordinary people walked into Gestapo offices or sent letters describing suspicious behavior they had witnessed. These tips formed the backbone of the secret police's investigative work. Historian Robert Gellately conducted groundbreaking research that transformed our understanding of how the Gestapo actually operated. In his book, The Gestapo and German Society, Gellately examined surviving case files from Gestapo offices in the cities of Würzburg and Düsseldorf. These records, preserved despite wartime destruction, allowed him to analyze exactly how the secret police learned about the cases they pursued. Goethli's findings were startling. Approximately 26% of all Gestapo cases in the cities he studied were initiated by voluntary denunciations from ordinary citizens. This was the single largest source of information leading to Gestapo investigations, larger than any other category. By comparison, only about 15% of cases began through the Gestapo's own observation and monitoring activities. The secret police's independent surveillance work generated far fewer cases than tips from the public. If one included denunciations that reached the Gestapo through other agencies, such as local officials or party organizations that had received citizen complaints, the proportion tied to popular denunciations rose even higher. The implications of this research were profound. The secret police was not primarily a proactive intelligence agency that uncovered hidden enemies through skilled detective work. Instead, it was largely a reactive organization that responded to information provided by German society itself. Citizens were volunteering to become the eyes and ears of the secret police. Goethli found that denunciations constituted the single most important cause of the initiation of Gestapo proceedings of all kinds. The secret police depended on this flow of information from the population. Without it, their limited personnel could never have identified the thousands of cases they pursued each year. But why did ordinary Germans denounce their neighbors? The motivations behind denunciations varied enormously. Some denouncers were true believers in Hitler's ideology, who felt it was their patriotic duty to report enemies of the state. They genuinely believed that communists, Jews, and other targeted groups threatened Germany, and they considered informing to be a moral obligation. Others had far less noble motives. Personal grudges drove many denunciations. A quarrel between neighbors, a dispute over an inheritance, a rivalry at work could all end with one party reporting the other to the Gestapo. The secret police became a weapon that anyone could use against their personal enemies. Jealousy played a role as well. A coworker resentful of a colleague's promotion might accuse them of making disloyal statements. A jilted lover might report an ex-partner for forbidden associations. Business competitors could eliminate rivals by suggesting they were politically unreliable. The regime had created a system where private disputes could become matters of state security. Some denunciations came from people seeking material advantage. During the persecution of Jews, informants sometimes hoped to benefit from the confiscation of Jewish property. Reporting a Jewish business owner might lead to opportunities for non-Jewish competitors. The regime's policies created incentives for predatory behavior. According to records analyzed by Goethli, the Gestapo was well aware that many denunciations were motivated by personal vendettas rather than genuine security concerns. Case files sometimes noted that a complaint appeared to stem from a private dispute. Yet the secret police investigated these cases anyway, using even frivolous accusations as opportunities to monitor the population. The culture of denunciation had deep roots in German society, but the regime exploited it like never before. Historian Robert Goethli noted that the habit of reporting neighbors was not created by the regime. Germans had been telling authorities about certain offenses for generations. What changed was that the regime turned denunciation into a main tool of control. It promoted informing through propaganda and punished people who failed to report those it labeled enemies. The result was a society where no one could trust anyone. A careless remark at dinner could be reported by a guest. A complaint about rationing could be overheard and passed along. Children were encouraged to inform on their parents if they showed insufficient loyalty to the regime. The bonds of family, friendship, and community frayed under the constant pressure of potential betrayal. McDonough described this phenomenon as turning the German people into their own prison guards. The organization did not need an agent on every street corner when neighbors were watching each other. The secret police did not need listening devices in every home when family members might report each other. Germans policed themselves, and the Gestapo simply processed the resulting flood of accusations. This dynamic explains how such a small organization achieved such extensive control. The Gestapo leveraged the participation of millions of ordinary citizens, transforming German society into a vast information-gathering network. Fear of the secret police was real, but much of that fear came from awareness that anyone might be an informant. According to Gelatelli, if the Gestapo was an instrument of domination, it was one constructed within German society whose functioning depended on the continuing cooperation of German citizens. The terror did not come only from above, it emerged from within German society itself. But what happened when someone actually fell into Gestapo hands? When the Gestapo decided to investigate a suspect, whether based on a denunciation or its own intelligence work, the organization possessed extraordinary powers. The legal protections that normally shielded citizens from police intrusion simply did not apply to this clandestine police force. Gestapo agents operated in plainclothes, dressing in ordinary civilian suits rather than uniforms. This made them difficult to identify and added to public anxiety about who might be watching. An agent could sit in a cafe, ride a streetcar, or stand in a crowd without anyone knowing they were observing. For identification, agents carried special warrant discs rather than regular police badges. These discs, about the size of a large coin, bore official markings that authorized the holder to act on behalf of the secret state police. Producing the disc was enough to compel cooperation from ordinary citizens and to silence questions from other authorities. The sight of a Gestapo warrant disc typically ended any resistance. The Reichstag fire decree of February 1933 had stripped away constitutional protections against police intrusion. Under normal circumstances, officers needed judicial warrants to search homes, open mail, or tap telephones. The decree suspended these requirements entirely, giving the Gestapo unlimited authority to intrude into private life. Gestapo agents could enter and search any home at any time without prior authorization from a court. They could seize documents, correspondence, photographs, and anything else they considered relevant to their investigation. Residents had no legal recourse to challenge these searches or demand the return of confiscated property. The secret police also monitored private communications without restriction. Agents could intercept and read personal mail passing through the postal system. They could tap telephone lines and listen to private conversations. They could demand that telegraph offices provide copies of messages. No form of distance communication was safe from potential interception. In his research on Gestapo operations, historian Carsten Dams documented how the organization built extensive filing systems to track the population. By 1939, the Gestapo maintained approximately 2 million index cards containing information on individuals considered suspicious or potentially dangerous. In addition, the secret police held roughly 600,000 personal files with more detailed information on specific subjects. These files represented years of accumulated intelligence on enemies real and imagined. The card index allowed agents to quickly cross-reference names, addresses, political affiliations, and personal associations. When a new denunciation arrived, officers could check whether the subject already appeared in their records. Previous investigations, known associates, and past suspicions were all documented and accessible. The personal files contained much more extensive information. Investigation reports, interrogation summaries, surveillance logs, and correspondence related to specific individuals all accumulated in these dossiers. Some files grew to hundreds of pages as the Gestapo compiled everything they knew about particular targets. But the Gestapo's direct monitoring capabilities, while substantial, were not unlimited. As discussed earlier, the secret police lacked the personnel to conduct comprehensive surveillance of the entire population. They had to be selective, focusing their watching and listening on individuals and groups already identified as suspicious. General monitoring of the population remained beyond their resources. To extend its reach, the regime used a network of helpers who were not formally part of the Gestapo, but still passed along information. Party block wardens, each responsible for a small neighborhood, kept track of residents' daily lives and wrote down anything that seemed unusual. According to Dams and his co-author Michael Stoll, these block wardens served as the regime's eyes and ears at the neighborhood level. Suspicious observations were reported up the party chain, often eventually reaching the Gestapo. Workplaces had their own networks of observers. The German Labor Front, which had replaced independent trade unions, assigned overseers to monitor worker attitudes and behavior. Factory floor conversations, complaints about working conditions, and expressions of discontent all risked being reported. The boundary between private opinion and public danger had effectively dissolved. Adding to this web of observation, Hitler Youth leaders watched for signs of disloyalty among young people, while teachers noted students whose families might hold improper views. Apartment building superintendents reported on tenants. Even physicians sometimes informed on patients who made questionable statements during consultations. The cumulative effect was a sense that observation was everywhere, even when formal Gestapo monitoring was absent. This extended network of watchers, combined with the flood of voluntary denunciations, meant that the Gestapo had access to far more information than its small staff could ever gather independently. The secret police sat at the center of an information web that stretched throughout German society. When all these sources pointed toward an individual, the Gestapo acted. An agent might appear at the suspect's home or workplace, produce the warrant disc, and demand that the person accompany them for questioning. From that moment, the suspect entered a system designed to extract information and punish enemies. The true horror began once someone was taken into custody. Gestapo headquarters in Berlin and regional offices throughout Germany contained basement cells and interrogation rooms where suspects faced questioning. What happened in these rooms was designed to extract confessions, identify accomplices, and break any resistance to the regime. The Gestapo employed professional interrogators trained to obtain information through various methods. These officers approached their work with bureaucratic efficiency, treating intensive questioning as a technical problem to be solved rather than a moral issue to be considered. Their goal was results, and they used whatever techniques they believed would achieve them. Interrogation methods ranged from psychological manipulation to physical mistreatment. At the milder end, interrogators used extended questioning sessions designed to exhaust and disorient suspects. A prisoner might face hours of repetitive questions, denied sleep, food, or access to a toilet. The pressure of unrelenting interrogation wore down resistance over time. Psychological tactics were common. Interrogators might alternate between friendly conversation and threatening rage, keeping prisoners off balance and uncertain what to expect. They presented fake evidence, claiming they already knew everything and that confession would bring better treatment. They threatened harm to family members, suggesting that wives, children, or parents would suffer if the prisoner refused to cooperate. In 1937, Heinrich Himmler issued an order that formalized the use of harsher methods. The order stated that in cases involving serious threats to the state, interrogators could employ what were officially termed third-degree methods. This bureaucratic language authorized physical mistreatment that had already been occurring informally. The order specified conditions under which such methods could be used and required authorization from Berlin for the most extreme measures. According to George C. Browder in his book Hitler's Enforcers, Himmler's order reflected the regime's desire to maintain some centralized control over interrogation practices. Local officers had sometimes acted without authorization, and the order established procedures intended to prevent random abuse while permitting approved mistreatment in significant cases. Survivors of Gestapo interrogation later described what they experienced. Prisoners faced physical abuse, stress positions, sleep deprivation, and threats against loved ones. Interrogators struck detainees with their hands, with truncheons, and with other implements. Some prisoners were forced to stand for hours or held in painful positions until they agreed to provide information. The regime maintained a veneer of bureaucratic procedure even in these circumstances. Interrogators kept records. Superiors reviewed cases. Authorization was required for escalating methods. This paperwork gave the appearance of order and legitimacy to a system designed to brutalize prisoners into compliance. Not all interrogations involved physical abuse. Some suspects faced only verbal questioning and psychological pressure. The Gestapo's approach varied depending on the perceived importance of the case, the stubbornness of the prisoner, and the individual tendencies of the interrogating officer. A suspect in a minor case might be released after routine questioning, while someone accused of serious political crimes faced far harsher treatment. According to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's research on Gestapo methods, many detainees died during interrogation or from injuries sustained during questioning. The exact numbers are impossible to determine because deaths in custody were often recorded with false causes or not recorded at all. Bodies were returned to families with orders not to open the coffins. The physical conditions of detention compounded the pressure of interrogation. Cells in Gestapo facilities were often cramped, dark, and unsanitary. Prisoners received minimal food and water. Medical care was largely non-existent. These conditions weakened prisoners physically and psychologically, making them more vulnerable to interrogation pressure. Isolation was another tool. Prisoners were typically held without contact with family, lawyers, or other detainees. They did not know what was happening outside their cells, whether their loved ones were safe, or what fate awaited them. This uncertainty was itself a form of psychological pressure. The goal of interrogation was not merely punishment, but information extraction. The Gestapo sought names of accomplices, details of organizational networks, and evidence of additional crimes against the state. A confession from one prisoner could lead to the arrest of many others. Interrogators were under pressure to produce results, which intensified their motivation to break resistance quickly. Some prisoners withstood interrogation without revealing useful information. Others broke quickly. The outcome depended on many factors, including the prisoner's physical and psychological resilience, the severity of the treatment, and sheer chance. There was no reliable way to predict who would hold out and who would give way. The records that survive reveal a system that combined bureaucratic procedure with systematic cruelty. Files documented interrogation sessions with careful notes on what the prisoner said. Authorization forms recorded approval for harsher methods. Reports summarized the information obtained and recommended next steps. This paperwork trail showed that the regime's violence was not random, but organized and purposeful. According to McDonough, what distinguished the Gestapo's methods was their organized nature. The violence was not the spontaneous brutality of individual officers, but a calculated system designed to maximize the extraction of information and the destruction of resistance. Bureaucracy and brutality worked hand in hand. Individual officers had enormous discretion over prisoners' fates. A Gestapo officer could decide to release a suspect with a warning or to send them to a concentration camp. This extraordinary discretion meant that a prisoner's fate often depended on the judgment, mood, or personal biases of individual officials. No external authority checked these decisions or ensured consistency. The Gestapo's freedom from court control meant its officers faced no legal consequences for how they treated prisoners. A judge could not order the release of someone held in protective custody, and a lawyer could not challenge the conditions of detention. The secret police answered only to their superiors within the regime's security system. This concentration of power in individual hands created tremendous opportunities for abuse. An officer who bore a personal grudge against a prisoner could ensure harsh treatment. An officer who had been bribed might show leniency. An officer's ideological fervor or relative moderation shaped how cases were handled. The system's lack of external controls meant that personality and prejudice influenced outcomes enormously. According to research on Gestapo case files, some officers did show restraint in certain circumstances. A suspect accused of a minor offense, with no previous record and no connections to organized opposition, might receive only a warning and surveillance. The Gestapo was not uniformly brutal in every case. However, the trend over time moved toward greater harshness. As the regime grew more radical in the late 1930s, and especially after the war began, tolerance for dissent dropped sharply. Cases that might have ended with a warning in 1934 could lead to camp imprisonment by 1939. The space for leniency shrank as the regime's beliefs demanded ever more complete removal of those it called enemies. McDonough documented this shift in his analysis of Gestapo practices. He noted that the vast majority of Germans investigated in the early years were eventually released, often with warnings or minor penalties. But as war approached and then arrived, outcomes became increasingly severe. The regime's willingness to destroy lives for minor transgressions grew steadily. The concentration camp became the ultimate destination for those the Gestapo deemed dangerous. When an officer determined that protective custody was warranted, the process was straightforward. A form was filled out, a superior approved it, and the prisoner was transferred to camp custody. There was no hearing, no appeal, no opportunity to contest the decision. The Gestapo's word was final. Enemies could be removed from society with minimal paperwork and no legal proceedings. The camps filled with people consigned there by Gestapo officers exercising their unchecked authority. The concentration camp system itself requires examination to understand the Gestapo's full power. The concentration camp was the Gestapo's ultimate weapon against enemies of the regime. While the camps were administered by the SS, it was the Gestapo that determined who would be sent there. The secret police served as the gatekeepers of a system designed to isolate, punish, and destroy those the regime considered threats. The first concentration camp, Dachau, opened on March 22, 1933, just weeks after Hitler became Chancellor. Located outside Munich, Dachau was established to hold political prisoners swept up in the crackdown following the Reichstag fire. What began as an improvised detention facility became the model for all the camps that followed. Dachau established the template for concentration camp organization and brutality. The SS developed systematic methods for managing prisoners, punishing infractions, and maintaining control through terror. The rules were harsh, and the punishments severe. Prisoners who violated regulations faced physical abuse, solitary confinement, or worse. The camp became a training ground for SS officers who would later run other facilities. Within 2 years, the camp system had expanded significantly. Sachsenhausen was established north of Berlin in 1936, close enough to the capital for convenient transport of prisoners. The following year, Buchenwald opened in 1937 near Weimar, in the heart of cultural Germany. Ravensbrück, opened in 1939, held women prisoners specifically. Each camp served as a destination for protective custody prisoners sent by the Gestapo. The secret police did not run the camps directly, but controlled who entered them. A Gestapo signature on a protective custody order meant transfer to a place of indefinite detention, brutal treatment, and possible death. By 1935, approximately 50,000 people had passed through protective custody in the camps. Some were eventually released, returning to society traumatized and warned to remain silent about what they had experienced. Others died in the camps from mistreatment, disease, overwork, or intentional killing. These facilities existed in a legal void where normal rules did not apply and no outside authority could intervene. According to the Nuremberg Tribunal judgment issued after the war, the concentration camp was the principal weapon the Gestapo used in performing its function. The tribunal noted that while the Gestapo did not administer the camp's day-to-day operations, it was responsible for sending people there and for conducting interrogations within the camp system. The threat of the camps hung over every interaction with the Gestapo. Germans who were summoned for questioning knew that the conversation could end with a protective custody order. This knowledge shaped how they responded to interrogation, how they cooperated with investigators, and how they monitored their own behavior to avoid future suspicion. The camp's mere existence was a form of social control. Conditions within the camps were intentionally harsh. Prisoners performed forced labor, received inadequate food, and lived in crowded, unsanitary barracks. Guards enforced discipline through beatings and punishments. Medical care was minimal or non-existent. Deaths from disease, exhaustion, and abuse were common. The camps also served as a warning to the broader German population. The regime did not keep the camps entirely secret. Germans knew they existed and understood that enemies of the state were sent there. Released prisoners spread word of conditions inside, despite orders to remain silent. This knowledge reinforced the fear that kept the population compliant. According to McDonough, the Gestapo used the threat of the camps strategically. Officers explicitly warned suspects that continued resistance would result in protective custody. The camps were presented as the consequence of failing to cooperate, an incentive that motivated many prisoners to provide information. The simplicity of the protective custody system gave the Gestapo enormous power. Unlike criminal prosecution, which required evidence, charges, and trials, protective custody was purely administrative. An officer who believed someone was dangerous could remove them from society with a few strokes of a pen. No prosecutor had to agree. No judge had to approve. The Gestapo's assessment was sufficient. This streamlined process meant that the camps could be used flexibly against whatever enemies the regime prioritized at any given time. In 1933, the camps held mostly political prisoners. By the late 1930s, they also held Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, habitual criminals, and others. The Gestapo could target new groups simply by issuing new categories of protective custody orders. Who were these men who wielded such power? The officers who staffed the Gestapo were not, for the most part, the fanatical ideologues that popular imagination might suggest. Research into the backgrounds of Gestapo personnel has revealed a more complicated picture of ordinary policemen who adapted to serve an extraordinary system. Most Gestapo officers were professional police detectives. They had trained in criminal investigation, learned questioning techniques, and built careers in law enforcement. Many had served in the political police forces of the Weimar Republic, the same agencies that had monitored extremist groups, including Hitler's own movement. When Hitler took power, these career officers faced a choice. They could resist the new regime and lose their positions, possibly facing arrest themselves, or they could continue their careers under new leadership, applying their professional skills to new purposes. Most chose to stay. The majority of Gestapo officers in the early years were holdovers from the Weimar police, experienced professionals who knew their craft. In his research on Gestapo personnel, historian Robert Galadely reached a striking conclusion. He found that most Gestapo men were not strong believers in the regime's ideas, yet they were also not opposed to it. They were professionals who adjusted to new conditions and followed orders without always sharing the intense beliefs of the party leadership. This portrait challenges the image of the Gestapo as staffed by true believers. Only a minority of Gestapo officers belonged to Hitler's party in the organization's early years. Party membership was not required, and many men in the force had no formal link to the movement. They saw themselves first as policemen who served whatever government was in power. According to McDonough, Gestapo recruits in the 1930s were selected primarily for their police expertise rather than their political commitment. The regime needed skilled investigators and interrogators more than it needed ideological warriors. Professional competence was valued over party credentials. However, the character of the Gestapo changed over time. Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich intentionally worked to infuse the organization with SS ideology. They transferred officers from the SD, the SS intelligence service, into Gestapo positions. These SD men were younger, more ideologically committed, and more willing to pursue the regime's enemies without hesitation. Research from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum shows how the Gestapo evolved from a mainly professional police force into something more radical. The mix of seasoned detectives and devoted party loyalists created an organization that combined strong investigative skills with growing political fanaticism. The knowledge of trained policemen blended with the zeal of true believers. Class and educational backgrounds also shifted over the years. Early Gestapo officers tended to come from lower middle-class families. Many had limited formal education, leaving school at 16 to begin police careers. They had learned their trade through practical experience rather than academic training. By the late 1930s, new officers entering the higher ranks often came from different backgrounds. According to McDonough, these newer arrivals frequently held university degrees in law or other fields. They were educated professionals who had chosen to serve the regime, bringing intellectual sophistication to the work of persecution. This mixture of backgrounds created a distinctive organizational culture. Older officers brought practical experience and institutional knowledge, while younger ideologues added energy and strong commitment to the leadership's goals. Together, they created an agency that was both professionally skilled and politically reliable. This combination made the Gestapo more effective than either group would have been on its own. Some officers clearly believed deeply in the regime's ideology of superiority and went after its enemies with personal conviction. Others seemed driven mainly by career ambitions, chances for promotion, and success within the bureaucracy. Still others simply did their jobs without much enthusiasm or protest, following orders and collecting their pay. The willingness of ordinary policemen to serve the regime raises uncomfortable questions. The Gestapo was not staffed by monsters, but by men who could have lived ordinary lives in ordinary times. They had families, hobbies, and normal human relationships outside their work. Yet they participated in a system of terror that destroyed countless lives. According to Galatli, this capacity for ordinary people to serve extraordinary evil is one of the most disturbing lessons of Gestapo history. The secret police did not require exceptional cruelty from its personnel. It required only that ordinary men follow orders, file reports, and allow the system to function. By 1939, the Gestapo had perfected a system of domestic terror. It combined legal immunity, citizen denunciations, surveillance networks, harsh interrogation, and the concentration camp system into an integrated apparatus of control. A relatively small force of officers leveraged the participation of ordinary Germans to monitor an entire nation. Fear pervaded society, suppressing dissent before it could organize. The organization had come far since its creation as a Prussian state agency in 1933. It had survived power struggles, reorganizations, and leadership changes. It had grown from Göring's personal instrument into Himmler's centerpiece of the SS security empire. It had perfected methods that would soon be exported across occupied Europe. The Gestapo was ready for war, and war would give it opportunities for action on a scale its founders could scarcely have imagined. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland and everything changed. Section 4. The Gestapo at War. The invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, transformed Germany into a nation at war. For the Gestapo, this transformation brought both expanded powers and new urgency. The secret police that had spent 6 years perfecting domestic control now faced the challenge of maintaining that control while Germany fought enemies on multiple fronts. War radicalized every aspect of the Gestapo's mission. Behaviors that might have drawn warnings or short detentions before 1939 now brought severe punishment. The regime demanded absolute loyalty from the German population, and the Gestapo enforced that demand with increasing harshness. Expressions of doubt about German victory became criminal acts punishable by death. Defeatism, the crime of expressing pessimism about the war's outcome, could result in a death sentence. A German who suggested that the war might be lost, that Germany's enemies were strong, or that the leadership was making mistakes risked being reported to the Gestapo. If investigators determined that such statements undermined military morale, the speaker could face the most severe penalties. Anti-Hitler jokes that had circulated quietly during the peacetime years became extremely dangerous once the war began. The regime saw humor aimed at its leaders as a form of political resistance that could weaken national unity. People were arrested, put on trial, and in some cases eliminated for telling jokes that mocked Hitler or other top figures. According to historian Richard J. Evans, in his book The Third Reich at War, the regime's intolerance for any kind of dissent grew stronger as the war went on. Complaints that might have been brushed off as harmless grumbling in 1936 could lead to protective custody or worse by 1941. The limits of what people could safely say grew tighter year by year. Even private activities in the home could bring Gestapo attention. Listening to foreign radio broadcasts, especially the BBC's German language service, was strictly banned. The regime knew that enemy radio gave Germans information that challenged official propaganda. Learning about real military setbacks or the crimes of the regime could weaken trust in the government. The Gestapo followed up reports of illegal radio listening and brought offenders to court. Punishments ranged from prison terms to death, depending on the details of the case and how officials described the offense. Germans who passed along information from foreign broadcasts to others faced especially harsh treatment. The German defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943 marked a turning point in home front control. The loss of an entire army at Stalingrad unsettled the German public. For the first time, many Germans began to doubt that victory was possible. The regime responded to this crisis of confidence by tightening control even further. Expressions of doubt that might have been tolerated in 1942 brought swift punishment in 1943 and beyond. In his research, historian Frank McDonough documented how the Gestapo's approach shifted after Stalingrad. Officers who had occasionally shown leniency became less willing to dismiss cases. The space for any deviation from complete loyalty essentially disappeared. One case from 1943 illustrated both the regime's ruthlessness and the courage of those who resisted. In Munich, a small group of university students formed a resistance circle called the White Rose. Led by Hans Scholl and his sister Sophie Scholl, along with their friend Christoph Probst, the group wrote and distributed leaflets calling on Germans to resist the regime. They condemned the war and the regime's crimes, urging passive resistance. On February 18, 1943, Hans and Sophie Scholl were observed distributing leaflets at the University of Munich. A building janitor spotted them and reported them to authorities. The Gestapo arrested the siblings and quickly rounded up other members of the group. According to accounts of their interrogation, the Scholls faced intense questioning but refused to betray their network. Sophie Scholl, just 21 years old, remained defiant throughout. The Gestapo passed the case to the regime's special political court, where Judge Roland Freisler presided over a brief trial. On February 22, 1943, just 4 days after their arrest, Hans Scholl, Sophie Scholl, and Christoph Probst were sentenced to death, and their lives were taken that same day. The White Rose case demonstrated both the regime's capacity for rapid, lethal justice and the existence of Germans willing to risk everything to oppose it. The Gestapo's efficient processing of the case, from arrest to death in less than a week, showed how thoroughly the organization served the regime's determination to crush any resistance. Other White Rose members were arrested in the following weeks, and many did not survive. The group's leaflets, which had called on Germans to wake up and resist, were seized and banned. Yet some copies survived, and the White Rose became a lasting symbol of German resistance long after the war ended. But the Gestapo's wartime mission extended far beyond German borders. As German armies conquered territory across Europe, the Gestapo followed close behind. The pattern established in Germany was exported to occupied nations, where the secret police worked to crush resistance, eliminate potential leaders, and terrorize populations into submission. The sequence was consistent from country to country. Wehrmacht forces would defeat enemy armies and occupy major cities. Within days, units of the security police, combining Gestapo and SD personnel, would arrive to take control of internal security. They seized local police headquarters, arrested known opponents, and began establishing the surveillance and control systems that had proven effective in Germany. The occupation brought the Gestapo's methods to millions who had never lived under its rule. In Poland, the first country invaded, the Gestapo helped implement a policy of planned destruction aimed at Polish leadership. German forces specifically targeted intellectuals, clergy, teachers, professors, military officers, and anyone else capable of organizing resistance. The goal was to eliminate Poland's educated class entirely. According to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's documentation, thousands of Polish professionals were arrested in the first months of occupation. Many were outright eliminated. Others were sent to concentration camps where most perished. The Gestapo maintained lists of prominent Poles marked for elimination and worked methodically through these lists. This pattern repeated as German forces moved west in 1940. In France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Norway, the Gestapo established regional offices and began the work of identifying and neutralizing potential resistance. Local police forces were either co-opted or replaced. Informant networks were developed. The apparatus of terror that Germans knew well was transplanted to occupied soil. The Gestapo's presence transformed daily life in occupied countries. Residents learned to fear the knock on the door that might come at any hour. People disappeared without explanation, taken for questioning and sometimes never returning. The same climate of suspicion and denunciation that existed in Germany spread to occupied territories as collaborators provided information to the occupiers. In 1941, the regime formalized one of its most chilling practices through a decree known as Nacht und Nebel, German for night and fog. Issued on December 7, 1941, the decree addressed how to handle resistant suspects in occupied Western Europe. The Night and Fog Decree created a system designed to maximize terror through uncertainty. Under this directive, suspects accused of crimes against the German occupation forces could be secretly transported to Germany rather than tried locally. Once in Germany, they would be held under conditions that prevented any information from reaching their families or communities. The decree specifically stated that the deterrent effect of these disappearances depended on keeping families in ignorance. If a prisoner died in German custody, no notice would be sent. If they survived to trial, the proceedings would be secret. The suspects would simply vanish, as the decree's name suggested, into the night and fog. According to Nuremberg trial documents, thousands of people from France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Norway were processed under this decree. Their families received no information about their fates. Communities were left to wonder what had happened to the missing. This uncertainty was itself a tool of terror. Individual Gestapo officers in occupied territories became notorious for their brutality. Klaus Barbie served as head of the Gestapo in Lyon, France, from 1942 to 1944. He earned the title Butcher of Lyon for his treatment of captured resistance fighters and Jews. Barbie personally participated in interrogations that subjected prisoners to extreme mistreatment. Survivors of Barbie's interrogations later testified about their experiences. Resistance leader Jean Moulin was captured in June 1943 and subjected to brutal questioning under Barbie's direction. Moulin died without revealing information about the resistance network he led. His fate illustrated both the courage of those who resisted and the depths to which the Gestapo would sink. Barbie also organized deportations of Jews from the Lyon region to the death camps. He personally directed the raid on a children's home in Izieu in April 1944, resulting in the arrest and subsequent deaths of 44 Jewish children and 7 adults. The Gestapo's occupation of Western Europe brought suffering on an enormous scale, but the Gestapo's darkest work awaited in the East. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, the nature of the war changed profoundly. Hitler viewed the campaign against the Soviet Union not merely as a military operation, but as a war of annihilation against what he called Jewish Bolshevism. The Gestapo would play a central role in making this ideological vision a reality. Following the advancing Wehrmacht were special units called Einsatzgruppen, a German term meaning deployment groups or task forces. These were mobile units composed of personnel drawn from the Gestapo, the criminal police, the SD, and other security forces. Their mission was to eliminate perceived enemies in newly conquered territory. The Einsatzgruppen represented a new phase in the regime's campaign of destruction. 4 Einsatzgruppen were organized for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Designated A, B, C, and D, these units followed each of the major army groups advancing into Soviet territory. Together, they comprised approximately 3,000 men at the start of the campaign. The units included experienced Gestapo officers who brought their skills in identifying targets and organizing operations. According to historian Christopher Browning in his book Ordinary Men, the Einsatzgruppen combined professional police personnel with ideologically committed SS members. This mixture of technical competence and fanatical purpose made them terrifyingly effective. The Einsatzgruppen's primary targets were Jewish civilians. Within days of the invasion, the violence began. Einsatzgruppen units entered towns and villages following the army's advance. They gathered Jewish residents, marched them to remote sites, and executed them. No one was spared. Men, women, children, and the elderly all lost their lives solely because they were Jews. The scale of violence escalated rapidly during the summer and fall of 1941. What began as targeted shootings of Jewish men expanded to include entire communities. By August 1941, the units began targeting women and children, as well as men. The goal had become the total destruction of Jewish communities in conquered Soviet territory. The methods were designed to eliminate many at minimal cost. Victims were typically forced to dig pits or were marched to natural ravines and ditches. Victims were often executed at the edges of mass graves. Sometimes new victims were forced to lie atop previous victims before being executed as well. Though psychologically difficult for the perpetrators, this method allowed small units to eliminate large numbers efficiently. According to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's research, the Einsatzgruppen submitted regular reports to Berlin documenting their activities. These reports, which survived the war, provide detailed accounts of the operations. They recorded numbers of victims, locations, and dates with bureaucratic precision. The reports reveal the staggering scale of destruction. By the end of 1941, just 6 months after the invasion began, over 500,000 Soviet Jews had perished. The campaign continued through 1942 and beyond, reaching into virtually every community with a Jewish population in occupied Soviet territory. One operation stands as a symbol of this campaign. On September 29th to 30th, 1941, Einsatzgruppe C, working with German police units and local collaborators, carried out a mass elimination at a ravine called Babi Yar near Kiev in Ukraine. The Babi Yar operation resulted in the deaths of 33,771 Jews in just 2 days. The Jewish population of Kiev had been ordered to assemble for supposed resettlement. They were marched to the ravine, forced to undress, and executed at the edge of the pit. The executions continued for 36 hours. German records documented the precise number of deaths. According to historian Raoul Hilberg, in his comprehensive work, The Destruction of the European Jews, Babi Yar represented the largest single mass elimination of the entire campaign. The efficiency demonstrated there, thousands perished in hours by relatively small units, showing what was possible when ideological commitment combined with organizational capability. The Einsatzgruppen were not the only perpetrators in the occupied East. German police battalions, Wehrmacht units, and local collaborators also took part in large-scale shooting actions. The Einsatzgruppen provided leadership and coordination, but the deadly operations involved far more than the 3,000 men in the original task forces. The regime mobilized thousands of participants for this campaign of destruction. Estimates compiled by historians placed the total number of people who lost their lives at the hands of the mobile units and their helpers at about 1.5 million. Most were Jews, though Roma, communist officials, and others targeted by the regime also died in these operations. The psychological impact on the men carrying out the shootings soon became a concern for the leadership. Officers reported that some soldiers and police suffered breakdowns after taking part in these repeated actions. These concerns about the perpetrators' psychological welfare, not concern for the victims, drove a search for different methods. The mobile units had shown that the will to carry out the destruction of entire communities already existed. They proved that thousands of men would take part in large-scale actions that led to many deaths when they were ordered to do so. Yet, the process was slow, very public, and psychologically costly for those who carried it out. The mobile units had revealed the regime's readiness for large-scale violence. Now the leadership looked for a more systematic method. The mass shootings in the East demonstrated that the regime was committed to destroying Jewish communities wherever German power reached. But as the scope of this commitment expanded, the leadership sought methods that could operate on an even larger scale with greater efficiency. The evolution toward a coordinated policy of total destruction accelerated through 1941. On July 31st, 1941, Hermann Göring signed an order directing Reinhard Heydrich to prepare a complete solution to the Jewish question in German-controlled Europe. This order gave Heydrich authority to coordinate all agencies of the German government in pursuing this goal. Göring's order marked a decisive step toward organized continent-wide destruction. The document directed Heydrich to submit a comprehensive draft showing the measures already taken and those planned for implementing the desired final solution. The language was bureaucratic, but its meaning was clear. The regime intended to destroy all Jews within its reach, and Heydrich would coordinate the effort. Heydrich had already built the apparatus necessary for this task. The security police and SD under his command had spent years identifying, tracking, and persecuting Jews. The Einsatzgruppen had demonstrated the capacity for mass destruction. Now Heydrich would bring all elements together into a unified program. The coordination meeting that finalized these plans took place on January 20th, 1942. Senior officials from various German government agencies gathered at a villa on the Wannsee Lake outside Berlin. Heydrich chaired the meeting, which lasted approximately 90 minutes. The minutes were recorded by Adolf Eichmann, who served as Heydrich's expert on Jewish affairs. The Wannsee Conference, as it came to be known, did not decide to destroy the Jews of Europe. That decision had already been made and was already being implemented in the East. Instead, the conference coordinated how various government agencies would contribute to the destruction and extended the program to encompass all of Europe. The conference minutes document plans for the forced removal and destruction of 11 million Jews. The figure of 11 million included not only Jews in German-controlled territory, but also those in countries Germany had not yet conquered, such as Britain, Sweden, and Switzerland. The scope of the plan revealed the regime's ambition to destroy Jewish life throughout the continent. According to the conference minutes, which survived the war and were introduced as evidence at the Nuremberg trials, the discussion covered logistical questions. How would Jews be identified and gathered? How would they be transported? What would happen to those considered fit for labor? The bureaucratic language masked the reality of what was being planned. Within the RSHA, Adolf Eichmann's office became the central clearinghouse for deportations. Eichmann headed Section 4B4, the office within the Gestapo responsible for Jewish affairs. This small office coordinated the identification, concentration, and transport of Jews from across Europe to eliminating centers in occupied Poland. Eichmann negotiated with railroad authorities for trains, coordinated with local police forces for roundups, and maintained schedules for the systematic destruction. The deportations began in earnest in 1942 and continued until the final months of the war. Jews were gathered from their homes, concentrated in transit camps, and loaded onto freight trains for transport east. Most were told they were being resettled for labor in the East. Few understood they were being sent to their deaths. The Gestapo and local police forces carried out the roundups across Europe. In France, the most notorious operation occurred on July 16th to 17th, 1942. French police, working under German direction, conducted a massive roundup in Paris known as the Val d'Hiv raid, named for the winter cycling stadium where many of those arrested were held. Over 13,000 Jews were arrested in the operation, including more than 4,000 children. They were held in the stadium under terrible conditions before being transported to transit camps and then to Auschwitz. According to historical records, fewer than 100 of those deported in this operation survived. The Gestapo coordinated similar operations across occupied and Allied Europe. In the Netherlands, Belgium, Greece, Italy, and elsewhere, local Gestapo offices organized the identification and deportation of Jewish populations. The methods varied by location. In some countries, local authorities cooperated extensively. In others, the German forces worked more independently. But everywhere, the goal remained the same. One of the largest and fastest deportation operations occurred in Hungary in 1944. Hungary had been a German ally, and its Jewish population of approximately 800,000 had survived largely intact until German forces occupied the country in March 1944. Adolf Eichmann personally traveled to Hungary to oversee the deportations. Working with Hungarian authorities and local Gestapo units, Eichmann organized the concentration and transport of Hungarian Jews with remarkable speed. Between May and July 1944, approximately 437,000 Hungarian Jews were deported, most to Auschwitz. The vast majority did not survive their arrival there. According to Hilberg's research, the Hungarian deportations represented the largest single operation of the entire destruction program. Eichmann's office coordinated up to 4 trains per day, each carrying thousands of people to their deaths. The operation continued even as Germany's military situation deteriorated. The scale of destruction organized through the Gestapo's offices defies comprehension. The regime's campaign against the Jews of Europe led to the loss of approximately 6 million lives. The Gestapo did not run the death centers or carry out most of the direct acts that took lives. However, the organization served as the essential coordinator, the office that identified victims, organized roundups, and ensured that trains ran on schedule to deliver people into those centers. Eichmann's Section 4B4 maintained detailed records of deportations. These records, many of which survived the war, document the bureaucratic process by which millions of lives were ended. Train schedules, population counts, correspondence with local authorities, all proceeded according to administrative procedure while human beings perished. As the war turned against Germany, the Gestapo faced threats from within. By the summer of 1944, Germany's military situation had become desperate. Allied forces had landed in Normandy in June. Soviet armies were advancing from the east. The Allied bombing campaign was devastating German cities. Many in the German military recognized that the war was lost. A conspiracy had been developing within the German Army Officer Corps. Senior officers who opposed Hitler or simply saw defeat as certain planned to eliminate the dictator, seize power, and negotiate peace with the Allies. The conspiracy included generals, diplomats, and other prominent figures who believed Germany must be saved from total destruction. On July 20, 1944, the conspirators attempted to eliminate Hitler. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, a decorated officer who had been severely wounded in combat, placed a briefcase containing a bomb beneath the table at Hitler's military headquarters in East Prussia. Stauffenberg left before the bomb exploded, believing Hitler was dead. The bomb detonated at 12:42 p.m., claiming 4 lives and wounding many others. But Hitler survived. The heavy oak table had shielded him from the worst of the blast. He emerged with only minor injuries, convinced that Providence had saved him for his mission. The failure of the assassination attempt unleashed the Gestapo's most intensive purge. Within hours, the regime understood that a conspiracy existed within the army. Hitler ordered a complete investigation and demanded that all those involved be found and punished. The Gestapo, led by Heinrich Müller, received authority to pursue the investigation wherever it led. The roundup began immediately. Over the following weeks and months, the Gestapo arrested approximately 7,000 people connected or allegedly connected to the conspiracy. The investigation expanded outward from the known conspirators to their families, friends, associates, and anyone whose loyalty seemed questionable. According to Evans, the investigation represented the most extensive internal security operation the Gestapo ever conducted. Officers worked around the clock interrogating suspects, tracing connections, and identifying new targets. The regime's paranoia extended to anyone who might have known about the plot or sympathized with its goals. The regime invoked the principle of Sippenhaft, holding families responsible for relatives' actions. Under this doctrine, the wives, children, parents, and siblings of conspirators could be arrested and punished simply for their family connection. The regime seized entire families and sent them to concentration camps, regardless of whether individual family members had any knowledge of the conspiracy. Children of conspirators were taken from their homes and placed in special camps. Some were given new identities to sever their connection to their families. The wives and parents of those involved faced imprisonment, and some were disposed. The regime sought not only to punish the conspirators, but to eliminate their families as well. The reprisals were swift and brutal. Many of the principal conspirators were tried before the People's Court, where Judge Roland Freisler, the same judge who had sentenced the White Rose members, presided. The trials were designed to humiliate the defendants rather than establish facts. Freisler screamed at the accused and denied them any meaningful defense. Those convicted were executed by hanging, many at Berlin's Plötzensee prison. Hitler insisted on a cruel method. They were hung with piano wire and their deaths were filmed. The regime intended these executions to be slow and agonizing, as a warning to others who might resist. Approximately 5,000 people lost their lives in connection with the July 20th plot. This total includes those executed after trial, those executed without trial, and those who died in concentration camps. The purge reached deep into the German military and civil service, removing many capable officers at a time when Germany desperately needed leadership. The July 20th investigation continued until the final days of the war. The Gestapo pursued leads and arrested suspects, even as Allied forces closed in from east and west. Some prisoners were executed in the final weeks, denied even the pretense of a trial as the regime collapsed around them. The conspiracy's failure ensured that Hitler remained in power until his death and that Germany fought on until complete destruction. The purge also demonstrated the Gestapo's enduring capacity for internal terror. Even in military collapse, the organization could identify, arrest, and destroy thousands of Germans suspected of disloyalty. The apparatus of terror that had been built over 12 years remained functional almost to the end. By late 1944, the end was approaching. Section 5. Collapse, Judgment, and Legacy. By the beginning of 1945, Germany's defeat was certain. Allied armies advanced from west and east, squeezing the Reich into an ever-shrinking territory. Cities lay in ruins from bombing campaigns. The Wehrmacht was shattered, reduced to desperate defensive actions and the conscription of old men and boys. Yet the Gestapo continued its work until the very end. As enemy forces approached, Gestapo offices throughout Germany and occupied Europe began destroying their records. Officers burned files, shredded documents, and demolished archives that contained evidence of 12 years of persecution. The meticulous records that had tracked millions of people were fed into fires as the regime sought to hide the scope of its crimes. The destruction of evidence was intentional and extensive. In Berlin, at the headquarters on Prince Albrecht Strasse, staff worked around the clock to burn documents. Regional offices received orders to destroy all sensitive materials before they could fall into Allied hands. Some records survived despite these efforts, preserved by the chaos of collapse or captured before they could be destroyed. But vast amounts of documentation vanished forever. Even as they burned files, Gestapo officers continued arresting people and carrying out executions. The final months of the war saw a wave of terror directed at anyone suspected of defeatism, desertion, or disloyalty. German soldiers who fled their units were hunted down. Civilians who showed white flags or spoke of surrender faced death. According to historical research compiled after the war, over 10,000 people were eliminated in this final wave of violence. The mass atrocities continued until Allied forces physically occupied German territory. The concentration camps became sites of final horror. As Allied armies approached the camps, SS and Gestapo personnel faced a choice. They could surrender the facilities intact, with their prisoners as witnesses to what had occurred. Or they could attempt to hide the evidence of their crimes. Many chose the latter. Prisoners were forced on death marches, driven on foot toward camps deeper inside Germany. Those who could not keep up were executed on the spot and left by the roadside. Thousands died from exhaustion, exposure, and violence during these forced evacuations. The marches continued even as the Reich crumbled around them. Some camp personnel executed prisoners rather than allow their liberation. Mass executions occurred in the final days, desperate attempts to eliminate witnesses. When Allied forces finally reached the camps, they found scenes of death and suffering that unsettled even battle-hardened soldiers. The leaders of the terror apparatus met various fates as Germany collapsed. Heinrich Himmler, who had built the SS and the Gestapo into tools of total control, tried to open secret talks with the Western Allies as the war neared its end. When Hitler learned of these contacts, he expelled Himmler from the party. Himmler fled using false identity papers, hoping to disappear in the chaos. British forces captured Himmler on May 23, 1945. When his true identity was confirmed and he was about to be searched, he bit down on a cyanide capsule hidden in his mouth. He died within minutes and escaped the trial and judgment that waited for other leaders of the regime. Heinrich Müller, the operational head of the Gestapo since 1939, simply vanished. Müller was last seen in Hitler's bunker in Berlin on May 1, 1945. After that date, he disappeared completely. Despite decades of investigation, his fate has never been conclusively determined. Some historians believe he died in Berlin during the final battle. Others suggest he escaped, perhaps to South America or even to the Soviet Union. The uncertainty about Müller's fate symbolizes the incomplete reckoning that followed the war. The man who had directed Gestapo operations for 6 years, who had overseen interrogations, deportations, and operations that led to the loss of countless lives, was never brought to account. Whether he lost his life in the rubble of Berlin or spent his remaining years in hiding, he escaped the judgment that others faced. With Germany's surrender came the reckoning. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. The Allied powers, the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, then faced a difficult question. They had to decide what to do with those responsible for the regime's crimes. The scale of what had happened was so great that normal criminal trials did not seem enough. The Allies agreed to create an international court to try the main leaders. The trial would take place in Nuremberg, a city in Bavaria where the party had once held huge rallies. Nuremberg was chosen for its symbolic meaning, and because its courthouse was one of the few large enough to hold such a case. The International Military Tribunal began on November 20, 1945. 22 leading figures of the regime sat in the dock. They faced charges that included starting wars of aggression, committing war crimes, and taking part in crimes against humanity. The prosecutors presented huge amounts of evidence, much of it taken from the regime's own careful records. Papers, photographs, and film showed the full reach of the leadership's actions to the world. The tribunal also had to decide whether some organizations should be declared criminal. If an organization was judged criminal, then simply being a member could be grounds for punishment. The secret police was one of the organizations examined in this way. The prosecution argued that the Gestapo had been a criminal organization from its founding. Prosecutors presented evidence of the organization's role in political persecution, the concentration camp system, the deportation and deadly persecution of Jewish communities, and many other brutal acts. They maintained that the Gestapo existed specifically to carry out criminal actions on behalf of the regime. On October 1, 1946, the tribunal delivered its verdict. The judges declared the Gestapo a criminal organization, along with the SS and the SD. The judgment stated that the Gestapo had been used for purposes that were criminal, including the persecution of Jews and the administration of a program involving the commission of crimes against humanity. Any person who had been a member of the Gestapo knowing of its criminal purposes could be punished. Among the individual defendants, Ernst Kaltenbrunner carried the most direct responsibility for secret police crimes. After Reinhard Heydrich died in 1942, Kaltenbrunner took over the RSHA, the main security office that controlled the entire system, including the secret police. He signed deportation orders and approved violent operations that led to many deaths. Kaltenbrunner was found guilty and sentenced to death. On October 16, 1946, he was put to death at Nuremberg prison along with 9 other condemned leaders of the regime. Until the end, he claimed that he had only followed orders and that he was not personally responsible for the crimes committed under his command. The tribunal rejected this claim. The Nuremberg judgment made clear that following orders was not a defense for crimes against humanity. Individuals remained responsible for what they did, even when acting under government authority. This idea became a key rule in international law and helped guide how later war crimes trials would be judged. But the major trial was only the beginning of the legal reckoning. Subsequent proceedings at Nuremberg tried additional groups of defendants. The Einsatzgruppen trial, held from 1947 to 1948, prosecuted 24 leaders of the mobile units that carried out mass shootings and other deadly actions. Prosecutors documented the systematic use of these units, showing how their operations caused the deaths of approximately 1.5 million people. The trial created detailed documentation of these mobile operations and placed individual responsibility on those who had led them, material later examined by historian Raoul Hilberg. The pursuit of justice continued for decades after Nuremberg. Adolf Eichmann, who had coordinated deportations from his desk at Section 4B4, escaped from Germany after the war. He made his way to Argentina, where he lived under a false name for 15 years. In 1960, Israeli intelligence agents captured him in Buenos Aires and brought him to Israel to stand trial. The Eichmann trial, held in Jerusalem in 1961, brought worldwide attention to the crimes of the regime against Jewish communities. Eichmann sat in a glass booth while prosecutors presented evidence of his role in organizing deportations. Survivors came forward to describe what they had lived through. Eichmann was found guilty and sentenced to death. On June 1, 1962, he was hanged at a prison near Tel Aviv. He remained the only person Israel has ever put to death following a criminal trial. His case demonstrated that those responsible for mass crimes could be pursued decades after their offenses. But justice was incomplete. While some faced trials and punishment, many who had taken part in crimes linked to the secret police never answered for what they had done. The Cold War changed international priorities, shifting Western attention from punishing former leaders of the regime to containing Soviet power. This new focus allowed many former officials to escape accountability. In the first years after the war, Allied efforts to remove the regime's influence from public life were meant to break its hold. Yet these programs were soon overwhelmed by the huge number of cases and weakened by practical limits. As the Cold War grew more intense, former officials of the regime were seen as possible assets instead of criminals who had to be punished. Western intelligence agencies recruited former German officers for their knowledge of the Soviet Union. The United States and other Western powers valued expertise about communist movements more than they valued pursuing accountability for past crimes. Some ex-Gestapo officers found new employment with their enemies. The West German government, created in 1949, gradually brought many former officials of the regime into its administration. In need of experienced staff for government and industry, the young republic allowed many who had served the dictatorship to return to their professions, and their wartime actions were often overlooked or forgiven. According to research documented by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, former Gestapo personnel found employment in the West German police, intelligence services, and legal system. The Federal Intelligence Service, known as the BND, employed numerous former SS and Gestapo members. Their expertise was valued despite their histories. Some escaped Germany entirely, finding refuge in other countries. Networks of sympathizers helped former officials and collaborators flee Europe, often through Italy and then on to South America. Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay and other countries accepted refugees who arrived with false documents. Some lived openly under their own names. Others took new identities and disappeared into their new homelands. Joseph Mengele, the SS physician notorious for his experiments on concentration camp prisoners, escaped to South America after the war. He lived in Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, evading capture for over 3 decades despite international efforts to find him. Mengele died in Brazil in 1979, having never faced trial for his crimes. Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lion, also escaped to South America. He was recruited by American intelligence for his anti-communist expertise and eventually settled in Bolivia. He lived there for decades under a false name, even working for the Bolivian government. It was not until 1983 that he was extradited to France. Barbie's trial in Lyon in 1987 brought renewed attention to the regime's crimes against humanity. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, where he died in 1991. His case demonstrated both the possibility of belated justice and the decades during which perpetrators had lived freely while their victims remained dead. The pattern of incomplete accountability extended beyond individual cases. Many lower-level participants in Gestapo operations were never identified or prosecuted. The destruction of records, the chaos of the post-war period, and the passage of time all contributed to letting countless perpetrators escape any consequence for their actions. What lessons can we draw from this history? The word Gestapo has entered languages worldwide as a synonym for secret police brutality. Decades after the organization ceased to exist, the term remained shorthand for arbitrary arrest, torture, and state terror. This linguistic legacy reflects the Gestapo's profound impact on how the world understands totalitarian control. The Nuremberg Principles establish standards that continue to guide international law. The tribunal affirmed that individuals bear responsibility for crimes against humanity, regardless of government orders. This principle, that following orders is not a defense, has been applied in subsequent prosecutions of war criminals from conflicts around the world. From the former Yugoslavia to Rwanda, prosecutors have invoked precedents established at Nuremberg. The Gestapo's history also demonstrated the importance of judicial independence and constitutional protections. The organization's power derived largely from the suspension of legal safeguards after the Reichstag fire. Once courts could no longer review police actions, once citizens lost the right to challenge their detention, the path to unlimited state terror was open. According to historian Robert Galately in his research on the Gestapo, one of the most disturbing lessons concerns the role of ordinary people. The Gestapo's effectiveness depended not just on its officers, but on the willingness of citizens to inform on their neighbors. The terror system required the involvement of ordinary Germans who chose to participate. This finding challenges any simple narrative of victims and perpetrators. The Gestapo exploited existing social tensions, personal grudges, and ideological commitments. It turned Germans against each other, making the population complicit in its own surveillance. The organization demonstrated how a dictatorship can mobilize society itself as an instrument of control. Galately's research showed that the Gestapo's fearsome reputation exceeded its actual capabilities. A relatively small organization created the impression of total surveillance by encouraging denunciations and cultivating fear. The perception of being watched proved almost as effective as actual watching. This insight remains relevant to understanding authoritarian systems today. Modern technology has given governments surveillance capabilities the Gestapo could never have imagined. Cameras, computers, and communication monitoring can track populations in ways that required armies of informants in the 1930s. The history of the Gestapo offers warnings about how such capabilities might be misused. The organization's history also shows how quickly democratic institutions can be dismantled. Germany went from a functioning democracy to a totalitarian state in a matter of months. The legal foundations for terror were laid within weeks of Hitler taking power. The speed of this transformation remains a cautionary example. The Gestapo's legacy extends beyond specific lessons to a broader historical significance. The organization embodied a system that sought to control not just actions, but thoughts and associations. It represented the state's claim to total authority over the individual. Its defeat and the judgment at Nuremberg affirmed that there are limits to state power that no government can legitimately exceed. The millions who suffered under Gestapo persecution, the political prisoners, the religious dissenters, the social outsiders, the Jews and others targeted for destruction, represent the human cost of unchecked power. Their experiences, documented in testimony, records, and historical research, stand as witness to what occurred and why it must not be repeated. The Gestapo's story reveals how swiftly the rule of law can erode under dictatorship. From its founding by Göring, through Himmler's expansion, to its wartime crimes, it shows a society's dark potential. However, the Gestapo was only one tool in the regime's system of control. To truly understand how an entire nation could be turned towards such purposes, we must look at how the regime's propaganda shaped and conditioned the population. To see how this happened, watch this next video.